안녕하세요. It's really both a joy and an honor to have this opportunity to be with you. At the beginning, I would like to thank all the organizers for really making this event possible, and to my colleague from CCT instructor, Siona Guan, for doing the difficult job of translating. I never had the pleasure of visiting your beautiful country, but I hope one of these days I'll be able to do it, because in my family, my wife and both of my two girls are great fans of South Korean pop culture. In 2020, some of you may know that I nearly came to Korea, but then of course, with pandemic, everything was put on hold. But I look forward to being in your beautiful country one day. So for this talk, my focus will be really on compassion, and more specifically on what I would call the journey of compassion today. So what I'm really excited about the journey of compassion today is how, several important forces are coming together that really point towards the possibility of making compassion as an active force, both in our own personal life in our difficult time, and also at the larger level of society. So in one sense, compassion is an old story in human history. Compassion is the key value of all the religions, especially in the Buddhist world. So it's an old story. But what is happening now is human beings are looking at compassion with a new understanding, with new sets of eyes. Because traditionally, compassion has been part of religious value. It is embedded in morality, and it is part of an instruction in a kind of a ethical code of living. So what is new today is the understanding of compassion as actually being an important part of our nature, a part of who we are. And based on this, trying to have a new story of human beings, a new story and understanding of who we are as a species. And along with this new understanding, there is also an attempt to translate this new insight and knowledge into practical applications, whether it is to do with human relationship, whether it has to do with in the healthcare, patient treatment, or whether it has to do with leadership training. So there is, in addition to understanding, there is an attempt to apply it in everyday life. So some of you may be familiar that in the secular space today, mindfulness, which is based on Buddhist meditation, is now adapted for many secular purposes. So something similar is also happening in the domain of compassion. But I would argue that what is happening now with relation to compassion has probably greater impact. So as I will say later, but what is happening today in the field of compassion, both on the science side and on the practical application side and the training side, this is really a result of a beautiful coming together of Buddhism on the one side and scientific discipline and research on the other. So let us look at the place of compassion in Buddhism very briefly. For example, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when giving a brief introduction to Buddhism, he says, the teaching of the Buddha, or the essence of the Buddhist teaching, can be summed up in 2 points. One is to adopt the view of interdependence, and then the second is to adopt the conduct of non-harming. So this principle of non-harming, ahimsa, at the basic level is avoidance of harming others, but at a more advanced level, it is an active force of helping others. And those who are familiar with Mahayana Buddhism will know that the 2 most important subject matters of the Buddhist sutras, Mahayana sutras, are compassion and wisdom. And then the compassion teaching is taught mainly through explanation of the Bodhisattva's life, such as the Jataka tales and all of this. So the vast practices of the Bodhisattva action is the compassion side of the story, teaching. And then the teaching on emptiness is really the wisdom side of the teaching. And historically, in many parts of the world, the teaching on compassion has been done especially for the lay people through the stories of the Buddha's previous lives, Jataka tales. And then there is an understanding that among all the values like forgiveness, kindness, compassion, self-discipline, the most important value is compassion. There is a statement in the Mahayana Sutra where it says that Buddha says, what is it, that one thing, when you have it in your hand, all the other values are in your hand? He says, it is compassion. So in Buddhism, not only is compassion taught as a value, but what makes the Buddhism unique in comparison to other world religions is that Buddhism also is very interested in the psychology of compassion and also the idea of how one can cultivate it. So because of this, interest because in Buddhism, enlightenment is something that one has to cultivate. And it is a process of, eliminating the ignorance and all the delusions, and also cultivating the good qualities of the human mind and heart. So because of this, there is a lot of emphasis in Buddhist teachings on developing awareness, attention, mindfulness, because one has to observe one's mind to be able to understand the nature of the mind. And part of that psychology also involves contrasting between, self-centeredness on the one hand and orientation towards others' well-being, more open-heartedness, and the difference between the two. And in the Tibetan tradition, which inherited the Indian Mahayana Buddhism, a particular emphasis is placed on the 8th century Buddhist master Shantideva's teachings. His very famous text called A Guide to the Bodhisattva Way, 8th chapter of this text, the second part of that 8th chapter is really seen as a key text on compassion, training on compassion. And in the Tibetan monasteries, many monks will memorize Shantideva's text, like I did, and because the text is also written in verse, so that it's easy to memorize. Just to give you an example, now this may be a little difficult for you to translate right now, but there's a verse which says, whatever sufferings there are in the world are a result of self-centeredness. Whatever happiness there is in the world are results of caring for others, other orientation. And he says, what more needs to be said? Just to compare between the childish sentient beings who are always thinking about themselves and the Buddha who is thinking about others. And another key point he makes is that, at the fundamental level, everybody wishes to be happy. Nobody wants to suffer. So this attitude or this recognition of the basic sameness is today referred to as common humanity. And the suggestion he's making is that if we are able to relate to anyone, whether friends or families or even people that we don't like, at the level of common humanity, we will never lose our compassion for the other person. And today, research also shows that being excessively self-focused is actually not very good for ourselves, because when we are excessively self-focused, we make ourselves vulnerable. We become vulnerable to stress because we take things too seriously and things take, out of proportion. So with that kind of attitude, when we confront difficulties and adverse situations, then we immediately think in terms of why me? Why this is happening to me? So one of the Tibetan teachers says that people who are excessively self-focused make themselves vulnerable, they're like someone carrying a big target on their back, which can be hit by arrow from many different directions. So the point Shantideva and these other teachers are making is that it is in fact in our own self-interest to be less self-centered, to have space for others, make space for others in our heart, and be more caring towards others. And they're also suggesting that when we do that, we can be more courageous, because if we are able to relate to everybody at the level of common humanity, just as I know I do not want to suffer, I'm looking for happiness, I love my family, I love my friends, we know at the same way the other person in front of me is exactly the same. So at the fundamental level, you recognize the sameness, so you're more relaxed, because there's, often in our life, many people live their life with anxiety, suspicion, worry. And so by taking compassion seriously, we can create this space and be more relaxed. And this relaxed attitude also brings courage. So this is why even for Buddhists, secular perspective on understanding the power of compassion, its benefits, and the psychology around it is helpful, because otherwise we rely heavily on the spiritual kind of perspective of saying, this is good for you, this will be good for your karma, this will be good for your rebirth. So our reasons become very religious. But if we bring the modern secular understanding and the perspective, then we appreciate the value of compassion based on our own personal experience, in day-to-day life. So most of us will know from our own personal life that there are people in our life who display this kind of, settledness, this kind of spaciousness and relaxedness. For example, that's one of the reasons why people find it very powerfully impacted when they have a chance to sit down with someone like His Holiness. You can feel the real sense of peace, real sense of ease and settledness. And some of you will know, some venerables in your life who display this kind of quality of sense of ease, and kind of, even when things go wrong, there's a kind of a sense of ease. They don't, they are more resilient. They don't get easily shaken. And clearly, people around you, they will enjoy your company, because it's not difficult to be in the presence of such people. It's actually joyful. And from a scientific point of view, it also makes perfect sense, because one of the new kind of, understanding is the importance of human beings being social animals, the social creatures. So because of this, once we are beyond the problems of basic needs like shelter, food, safety, the rest of the time, most of our experiences of happiness or suffering is due to our interaction with fellow human beings as a result of our relationships and interaction. And this quality of social connection is now, studies after study. There was a very famous Harvard longitudinal study that looked at men in their 50s and then followed up 30 years later in their 80s, to see what are the best predictors for longevity and happiness and good health. And they did many, many factors, but one important factor that came through was the quality of social relations reported when they were in their 50s. So we know from our own personal experience, when we are able to make a connection, deep connection with someone, that experience is profound, and also when we are able to make a difference in someone's life, help someone in a genuine way, we also feel great. I mean, that's who we are as a species. We are not meant to be alone and isolated. So when the scientists were doing research on compassion, at the beginning, they were puzzled, because compassion involves paying attention to someone's problem in addition to yours, paying attention to someone's suffering. But in the brain, they saw the reward centers and happiness centers, brain that are connected with the reward and happiness was being activated. So they was thinking, what is going on here? Compassion is supposed to be suffering, and the brain seems to suggest there is a kind of a reward and joy. And they are now beginning to understand the mechanisms by which, compassion arising activates the reward center is because when we experience compassion, we feel deeply connected and with another person. And this sense of connection and being able to express our social nature through empathy and compassion really brings that sense of reward. So that's how it is understood between well-being and compassion, the connection. And another connection is coming through the compassion giving rise to a sense of purpose. And sense of purpose is crucial for a genuine sense of happiness. So we all know, for example, like when we are able to really make a difference in someone's life, we get a sense of fulfillment. We matter. And also at a workplace, when your work is not valued, it's very difficult for you to be part of the team. So we as human beings, as social creatures, we need recognition. We need the understanding that we matter, our roles matter, we serve a purpose. So all of this rich psychology and insights into compassion and its place in human nature and its power, all of these are really important part of the Buddhist teaching. So what is new now is the ability to articulate these insights in purely secular language. Because in the traditional context, in the texts, these teachings and insights are very embedded in traditional Buddhist framework, Buddhist ideas, and Buddhist language. And similarly, many of the traditional practices also include aspects of training that presupposes Buddhist worldview, like one of the important training in the Tibetan tradition is to recognize all beings as your mothers, which presupposes the concept of rebirth. So the person who has been responsible and making the most important contribution to this adaptation of Buddhist insights into a more universal secular approach and language is the Dalai Lama. And his attempt is to do a couple of things. One is to really invite science to study it. And when science develops an understanding, it will use a language that is natural language and more universal. And also ground the understanding of compassion as part of understanding human nature. Just like we recognize anger is part of our nature, attachment is part of our nature, craving is part of our nature, jealousy is part of our, natural human emotion. In the same way, compassion, caring, kindness should be recognized as natural part of who we are. And one of the important things about this is to recognize compassion can be a powerful motivation. So just as you can anger be a motivation, jealousy can be a motivation, a sense of justice can be a motivation, sense of fairness can be a motivation. In the same way, compassion and caring can also be a motivation. And this is recognized specifically in Buddhism, because the Bodhisattva, the idea of a Bodhisattva is someone whose action is motivated by compassion. Another important thing that His Holiness did was to urge the creation or development of more secular adaptations of Buddhist practices like mindfulness, emotion regulation, emotional awareness, compassion, loving kindness. So he has really encouraged the more secular adaptations of these practices. And the simple idea behind the meditation and mental training in Buddhism is the simple idea that we can turn our own mind into our ally. So just as our mind can be our own enemy, because often problems are caused by our mind, in the same way, our mind can be our own friend and ally. So practices like mindfulness, paying attention, developing awareness of our emotions, being able to regulate, emotions so that we observe, and then also nurture our basic kindness so that this becomes more of a natural state of who we are. So these are essentially, aspects of the mind which are there in us, but we are now bringing them out and cultivating them in a more systematic way. So that, in a nutshell, is the aim of meditation. Of course, there's a big difference between how these practices are undertaken in the traditional Buddhist context and in a more secular, everyday context. Because in the Buddhist context, these practices are engaged in with the ultimate view of attaining enlightenment. And also your compassion is much more ambitious. You want to embrace all beings, so you want to really move to the final level of total selflessness. But in the secular context, the aspirations are more modest. People are looking not so much to become enlightened, but rather to become a better person, to turn their mind into an ally so that they can live a more meaningful, rich relationship and also a purposeful, joyful life in this. So and another important thing that has happened alongside the Dalai Lama's, encouragement for creation of this program, reaching out to scientists to take, study compassion. Another important development that has happened is in science itself, where I will identify two things. One is scientists were able to develop very powerful brain imaging technologies, especially, MRI, functioning MRI, which allows you to see brain in action. Another important discovery was the discovery of neuroplasticity, so that the brain changes in response to training or experience. So those two discoveries and inventions really made it possible for them to start looking at effects of meditation. So today, not only are there programs on mindfulness, emotion regulation, compassion, loving kindness that are secular, distributed, including the one I developed at Stanford, which is Sona is a certified instructor. And there are also, development of specific adaptations for important professions like healthcare, prevention of burnout. There are programs for education, for teachers and children. They are programs using compassion and loving kindness for leadership training. Also police officers training. So they are now, in addition to making general programs, they are also beginning to be specific adaptations. So, if you think about it, it makes perfectly logical sense, because any profession that involves interaction with general public, which has a service dimension, then the quality of that interaction is going to make all the difference to the member of the public who are accessing that service. And now we have enough data, especially in the healthcare, to show how when doctors are able to display genuine compassion, even for a minute, less than a minute, 40 seconds, it really makes a qualitative difference to the patient experience. So not only is the positive effect just psychological, which makes sense, but they also discovered that there are physiological level impact from caregivers' display of kindness and compassion. So there's a big book written by two physicians from Cooper University in the US, and it's called Compassionomics. And these doctors are making the case that even from economic, financial perspective, from the healthcare providers, it makes financial sense to bring more compassion in the patient care, because in terms of the effect of the treatment, quality of the experience of the patient, and their compliance with treatment, with the medication that they take, all around the impact is deep and profound. So then there is the question that physicians might say, yes, all of this may be true, but I don't have time. If I need the time to show compassion, it's going to take up a lot of time. I need to listen for long. But then these two researchers pointed out, looking at the European study and an American study, that on an average, it takes not more than 40 seconds extra. Because most patients appreciate the preciousness of the doctor's time. They are not going to waste it. So what is required is a certain body posture, the tone, making eye contact, and listening. Quite often physicians immediately interrupt the patient's report, self-report. So sort of, honoring the personal experience of the patient, because the patient has the first person experience. Doctor may be the expert, but when it comes to the actual experience of this illness, the patient has the first person experience. So just honoring that, the research shows that it does not take more than average 40 seconds. So bringing compassion consciously really does not involve doing something new. It really involves doing something in a slightly different way, in a conscious way, allowing our natural human response to kick in, making the human connection. So it's a sort of a more conscious way and intentional way of interacting with others. So it involves adopting a certain mindset and bringing a certain attitude and being conscious about the intention that you have. And, this is particularly important for those of us who live a family life, where relationship, daily interaction is an important part of who we are. I'm the father of two girls. Now they're in their early 20s. And when they were especially going through the teenage period, I saw many of my friends, my children's friends, parents struggling. And, we were lucky, partly because we were quite conscious about, when we are interacting with our children, we're not bringing self-centered issues like respect for the parent. Why, if you don't do this, you're not respecting me, you are defying my authority. Instead of this, when the focus is on the child, their safety, if they come too late at night in this city, it's not safe for you. When the focus is really about them, their well-being, their safety, it completely changes. This reminds me of a story. Some of you may know, actually, I was a monk before, and I left the monastic life and became a lay person. So once I was traveling with the Dalai Lama somewhere, and then it was a sort of a more informal tea with someone that he knew. And then he pointed to me, and the person was asking about the Buddha's life, and His Holiness told the story. And then he pointed to me and said, Jinpa, my English translator, he did the exact opposite what the Buddha did. Buddha was married, but then later became a monk. Jinpa was a monk before, and now he's he's married. And then he turned to me and said, now he's going to know real suffering. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that really the way you look at situation, the way you look at your relationship with others, the way the way in which you bring a certain intention into a situation, all of these really changes what happens. Because, for example, like when a parent scolds a child who comes back after the curfew. So, for example, like you're supposed to, here in the West, when children are around 16, we allow them to go to parties to other friends, but especially during the weekends. But then we used to have a rule saying you have to come before 12 o'clock. And if you can't come before 12 o'clock, you're supposed to call us. Anyway, children sometimes they don't obey the rules. And then you're waiting, and when they open the door, you're there. So what do? You have to tell them off. You have to scold them. That has to happen. But why you scold them is where the difference is. If you're scolding them because you're angry, that you don't like the fact that they are not respecting you, they're defying your authority, you think they are challenging your power, that's one way of doing it. The other one may be because you're afraid if they get into this bad habit, it may be to compromise their safety in future. This is not good for them. That's another kind of attitude. The first attitude has nothing to do with the kid. It has to do with you. Whereas the second kind of the attitude has nothing to do with you. It's about the child. Even though the action may be the same, but the intention behind the action makes all the difference, and children will know where the intention is coming from. So, in brief, by taking something like compassion seriously, by being more intentional, by connecting with your aspirations, by making compassion your key value, your philosophy of life. All of this, in the end, you create a much more joyful and meaningful life. You become less vulnerable to stress. Okay, you're more resilient because you're creating a more space in your mind. And also, you have greater kind of tolerance for people's weaknesses and problems, because we know, for example, sometimes people do strange things because they are suffering, not because they want to do it. So we begin to really see others' action in a different way. And so whether it has to do with the stress relief, whether it has to do with resilience, whether it has to do with quality of relationship, and even your own health and well-being, taking something like compassion seriously and finding ways to make it an active force in our life in a conscious way really is powerful and beautiful. So this is why I'm in my main work is really to do with working on Tibetan texts. I oversee translation projects and editing of text, but the public-facing work that I do is really in these secular adaptations of compassion, because I truly believe that any person who chooses to adopt this way of living really not only stands to gain themselves, but also the ripple effect of it is created around so that many more people benefit. So my motivation for creating CCT, which is an eight-week secular compassion training, is really to make these kind of insights and practices much more widely available, so that people from any different background, religious background, different religions, or with no religion, can really relate to them, because it's really grounded in one's own personal human experience. So I also believe that although these programs and trainings were developed for secular space and secular audience, but I also believe that in the traditional Buddhist societies, adoptions of these programs can be really helpful, because especially for the younger generation, because these more secular adaptations to the program directly relate to everyday life and everyday situation and everyday problem. And this way, younger generation of the traditional Buddhist communities can see the relevance and benefit of the Dharma teachings, because otherwise the value of Dharma teaching is left only to the next life. And then you forget, actually, this life is also a life you're living. So the best scenario is you create good karma for next life, but also in this life, you live a good, ethical, and compassionate and kind life. So, and there's no reason why we cannot do both. So that's why I think in the traditional Buddhist communities also, taking seriously about these more secular versions of the training can be helpful. So, for example, when the Dalai Lama gives teachings to even to his Tibetan community, especially for the younger generation, he would actually begin by focusing more on the relevance and benefit of Dharma practice in this life, dealing with difficult situations and dealing with difficult people in your life. How do you remain resilient in the face of a failure? For example, like students, often don't get the marks they want. So when they don't get the marks they want, they fail. Well, how do you, if you don't have a resilient mind, you're going to defeat yourself. So he actually makes it very clear how the teachings of Dharma can actually be applied and be relevant in day-to-day life and need. So I do not see any conflict or contradiction between, training and insights and ideas taken from Buddhism and applying it outside the context of Buddhist practice for general public. I don't see there is any problem or contradiction, because when we say secular adaptations, we're not rejecting Dharma. We're basically repackaging and reframing the practices and insights in a way that is more universal, that can be applied, that's more at the fundamental level of human reality. So it's more like the basic human reality without using the specific language and concept that is unique to Buddhism. So I don't think the word secular should be seen as something contradictory to Dharma. So as a result of sharing something like this, if someone is able to help deal with some of their problems, that's a service. And the Buddha himself said, I taught only one and one thing only, suffering and its elevation. The elevation of suffering was the primary motivation of the Buddha. And also from a Mahayana Buddhist point of view, the highest ideal is to help others and help others elevate suffering and problem. So, I don't think if we're serious Mahayana Buddhist, our concern should not be trying to convert people to Buddhism or try to make people Buddhist. Our primary motivation has to be, how can we help? It's the helping other people help deal with their problem has to be the primary motivation. So I really see what's happening now with these secular adaptations of Buddhist practices as a beautiful contribution and offering to the world from Buddha Dharma. So therefore, in Korea, we have right now only one certified instructor of CCT, Sona. So my wish and hope is that there will be more of you. And maybe Sona might be able to start a teacher training so that you can certify people directly in Korean language. And that way, I think, the more, people who are trained in this kind of teaching are available, the more it would be able to make, contribution to the broader society. Because if we are able to bring these kind of mindsets and attitudes and intention and values into key sectors like healthcare, law enforcement, education, leadership, workplace culture, just imagine the impact that would be felt by millions of people who are going to be at the receiving end of the interaction of these services. And that is a beautiful Bodhisattva offering. So in conclusion, I would like to thank all of you for really taking the time and paying so much attention and really taking interest in this important topic. And we will have a short time for question and answer, so please feel free to ask questions. And the questions need not be necessarily related to what I said. So any questions you might have. The meditation, the term, we should not have the understanding that meditation only refers to quieting the mind and staying still. That's one important part of meditation practice. But we need to have an understanding that there are varieties of meditation. Some meditations are stilling the mind, quieting the mind, settling the mind, resting on your breath, and allowing your mind to be relaxed and open. So that's one type of meditation. But then there are other types of meditation which are more analytic, where you are looking at the nature of mind and looking deeply and recognizing its impermanence. So that's another type of meditation where you are using discursiveness or analysis. And then there are other types of meditation where you are using visualization, your imagination. So it's important, first of all, to recognize that there are different types of meditation practice. And what is common to all of them is a disciplined application of the mind, which involves paying focused attention and a certain degree of repetitiveness. So that's what makes them all similar, but they are different types. Okay. And then you can also have deeply devotional meditation that takes the form of faith towards the Buddha by reflecting or contemplating the Buddha's quality, Buddha's compassion, and then developing a deep faith and remaining single-pointed in that state of mind. And some of these devotional meditations can be so powerful that you can have tears in your eyes because you're so, absorbed. So unlike mindfulness, compassion cultivation uses, therefore, varieties of meditation techniques. For example, as a basis, it requires the basic meditation practice of settling the mind, just resting, being able to settle down. Because otherwise, if your mind is restless, unsettled, then you cannot apply it. So it requires the basis of being able to quieten. So that's why we use the deep breathing exercises to bring the mind and then let it rest on the breathing so that it begins to settle down. So this resting, settling practice is used. And then connecting with your intention and aspirations involves a little bit of activity. And then if you're thinking about common humanity, then it involves discursive thinking of making connection between self and others, recognizing the oneness. So it's not a sort of settling down alone. And then when you're using loving kindness meditation for a loved one or a difficult person, then you are imagining this person in front of your mind and going through a difficult time and allowing your natural emotion and response to arise. So, and then paying attention to this. So then you're creating a scenario in your mind using imagination. So compassion training uses these multiple sort of methods of meditation. So let me respond to the second question about the person trying to be compassionate and not always succeeding and feeling guilty. So this is an important question. And here, what I would like to say is that we should try to have an understanding of compassion that is not just confined to feeling compassion. Compassion should be more expanded to include compassionate intention, compassionate attitude, so that you don't expect the feeling to be there all the time. Expecting feeling to be there, especially towards a difficult person, like someone that has caused you a problem, that is asking too much of yourself. But someone who takes compassion seriously, you can work it so that you have the intention to bring compassion. You can have the attitude towards the other person, saying, recognizing the common humanity. So even though you may not like the person, but that does not prevent you from recognizing, just like me, this person also doesn't want to suffer. So that is possible. So when you fail to bring compassion into a situation, and when you feel guilty because you care about bringing compassion, guilt as an initial emotion is healthy because it's going to remind you next time that you will do better. But what is important is to simply recognize that feeling of discomfort, but then don't stay there. Because the problem with guilt is that at some point, guilt will be about yourself, your own feeling. It will be not about the situation. It will be not about compassion. So this is where it's important, because the guilt is an important moral sentiment, but guilt at some point can become dysfunctional. Then it becomes self-centered. And also in these situations, when you feel the guilt, it's important to bring a degree of self-kindness to yourself too, because you're trying. You're not a perfect. So just that simple remembering that, I'm trying here, I'm trying my best, I'm just another human being. Having that humility and self-kindness is a healthier response. So next, let me take the other important question, which is an important one, especially in the traditional Buddhist context. The question about how, as secular adaptations like MBSR and MSc and CCT, as these secular adaptation programs become more and more widespread and popular, some people might think that the traditional Buddhist practices about mindfulness or compassion and loving kindness may be like old-fashioned, out of sync with time, not that effective. Isn't there a problem? And this, I think, is a very important issue. I think it's a really important issue. And this is a question that I myself has struggled, because, I come from traditional Buddhist background. I'm a practicing Buddhist. I have very close connection with my monastic community. I still teach monks in the monastic, not the Dharma, but the classical philosophical texts. That's my expertise. So this question is something that I take seriously. So, here it is important to recognize that the scope and the aim are completely different between the traditional Buddhist context and the secular context. So as I said before, in the secular context, the objective is more modest. Whereas in the Buddhist context, the objective is much more ambitious. It is to become a bodhisattva. It is to, completely eliminate the afflictions. It is to attain nirvana. It is to attain, good rebirth. Whereas in the secular context, it's very connected to the everyday life. So that the scope and the aim are quite different. In one way, one could look at the secular adaptations as being a basic level practices. So for example, if you take the example of mindfulness practice, okay, in the traditional mindfulness practice, you have mindfulness of body, mindfulness of feelings, mindfulness of mind, mindfulness of the objects of mind. So you go progressively. And all these mindfulness practices are connected with, the deepening one's insight into the nature of impermanence, suffering, no self. These you don't see in the modern version. In the modern version is really about learning to pay attention, stay in the present, apply meta-awareness so that you can observe, but you don't go deep into the insight path. So how can you say that the modern version can replace the traditional teaching. The modern version is a lighter, basic version, which ideally, because it is easier for a Buddhist, as they learn something from this, then they would want to go deeper. It will be like the opening of a door. So so I don't see any contradiction here, but there can be a problem. For example, if people begin to confuse the modern adaptations as being the essence of the Buddhist teaching, the essence of the path, the highest path, then thinking that the traditional approach is somehow culturally irrelevant. It was a product of a time. In those days, people did not know much better. So if this is the attitude that comes, then it is dangerous. We understand the modern versions are basic levels of practice, and the traditional ones are in the context of Buddhist framework, then it's okay. But if you confuse the secular versions as representing the essence of Dharma, and then thinking that the traditional versions are more culturally kind of, specific practices, then we have a problem.
예, 저는 미산이고요. 지금 카이스트 명상과학연구소에 있습니다. 과학이 지향하는 것과 그리고 방법론과 불교가 지향하는 그 최종적인 목표와 또 거기에 도달하는 방법론이 달랐을 때 어떠한 태도로 달라이라마 스님께서 그리고 또 진파 선생님께서 그러한 것들을 어떠한 태도로 지금까지 몇십 년 동안 다루어 왔는지 그게 제 질문입니다.
Thank you, Venerable. These questions are really profound. I agree that the methodology and the goals of science and Buddhism are very different. Science is not interested in attainment of liberation, enlightenment. Science is more interested in understanding the nature of reality and describing, having a good, clear picture of reality. Buddhism does involve exploration of reality, but it's not for its own sake. The exploration of reality is for the sake of elimination of ignorance and gaining liberation and enlightenment. So the goals are very different. But where His Holiness and I, our assumption is that at the level of basic method, there is a shared commitment on both the Buddhism and science to the importance of facts, importance of knowledge, and importance of rigor and understanding. So, and that's partly because unlike other religions, Buddhism does not emphasize belief and faith. It emphasizes understanding and reason. So there is some shared basis. Where there is a big difference is the fundamental assumption in science is that ultimately everything is reducible to matter, which Buddhism cannot share. In Buddhism, in addition to matter, there is consciousness. And consciousness and matter are two completely interdependent, but two completely different types of phenomena. So there is a difference, but on the science side, at the moment, this assumption that everything is reducible to matter is an assumption. It's a theory. It's not a proven conclusion. So I think despite the fundamental differences, I think there is a lot of room. There is a lot of scope for the two to come together in the service of finding something together for the sake of humanity. As a result of science and Buddhism collaboration, many advances in scientific understanding of mind, such as, if you look at the current understanding of what is meant by attention, mindfulness, compassion, loving kindness, empathy, all of these refinement in scientific understanding has come from interaction with Buddhist ideas. Because, science talks about brain. The lived experience, language has to come from the mind side. This is one area where Buddhism is very, very rich. So if you look at all the scientists who are doing research on attention or mindfulness or meta-awareness or compassion or empathy, they have interacted with, Buddhists. And for the Buddhists, the benefit is that the scientific perspective brings a rich explanation of the brain functions and the correlation of this mental activity, because none of the traditional Buddhist texts anything about brain. So there's a benefit for the Buddhist side too.
박사님 너무 감사합니다. 아주 귀중한 자비에 대한 말씀 주셨고요. CCT를 개발하셔서 세상에 정말 자비가 많이 퍼질 수 있도록 이렇게 해주신 것에 대해서 감사드리고요. 또 한국은 아까 말씀하신 대로 한국에는 권선아 선생님 한 분의 씨앗이라고 저는 생각합니다. 좋은 씨앗을 심었기 때문에 한국에서도 많은 열매들이 CCT 열매들이 맺어들이라고 생각합니다. 다음에도 꼭 초청해서 이제 대면으로 그 K-팝 좋아하는 두 따님과 부인께서 오셔서 좋은 아름다운 우리 사찰들이 아주 몇천 년 된 사찰들이 많이 있습니다. 거기서 묵으시면서 좋은 음식도 먹고 더 깊은 그 담론을 이어갔으면 좋겠습니다. 다시 한번 깊은 다르마 프렌즈 지현 스님 그리고 은강 스님 그리고 다른 우리 모든 단체들을 대표해서 감사의 마음 올립니다.
Well, thank you all, and thank you, Venerable, for your kind invitation, and thank you all for spending the time, paying attention, caring about compassion, and also I see all of you as ambassadors of this work, and through your enthusiasm, through your passion for compassion, you'll be able to spread more widely. Thank you.